couple things actually, and that I would like to talk about, and I forgot that we were going to have a tax expert, David, and I'm looking at you when I say that, and because a couple of the two things that I'd like to talk about touch specifically on taxes and specifically U.S. If I could start real quick with the point of so-called CARES Act. Everybody's heard about that. Everybody probably knows that there was a stimulus check, or in reality, a stimulus debit card, if any of you received those things. But I got a question for you. Does anybody know what CARES stands for? Playing Jeopardy music in the background right now.
You're going to share, Jim.
What's that?
I said, looks like you're going to share. Nothing.
Yeah, I'm going to. It is the Corona Aid Relief and Economic Securities Act. And why I'm bringing that up, and it is tax related, is I wanted to remind everybody of something that you may have heard about much earlier on in the year, but is becoming relevant. Both aspects that I'm going to talk about, you've probably heard about, but now are coming to a point where they're going to be extremely relevant. And one of them is the CARES Act, and specifically the advanced refund that people were eligible to receive. That was $1,200 for single filers, $2,400 for married, plus $500 for children. And how that came up in the context of mobility specifically is that you have individuals who have significant amounts of imputed income. And there are thresholds for what they call AGI, adjusted gross income, to the extent, for example, that if someone had imputed relocation expenses in their income in either the tax year 2018 or 2019, that could have potentially either reduced and or altogether eliminated their eligibility for that advance check. Mm-hmm. And while that is in fact true, what people did not necessarily take note of is that the monies that we received, if you received it, is actually an advance on your 2020 tax return. Mm-hmm. So early on, when we had a number of employees, transferees come to us and ask about this, he says, oh, my refund or my credit was reduced by $500 or $1,000 because I had $50,000 of relocation expense in my income on my 2018 or 2019 return. I said, oh yeah, right, I guess we got to pay that. But then in consultation with our tax advisors, I learned, and this is the key thing, is that credit, that amount you received, is an advance on the 2020 return. So if an individual, for example, had a reduction because of relocation expenses in the previous year, the actual amount that they received will be taken into consideration on their 2020 return, and they may be entitled to a difference if, for example, or the remainder, if in fact that was not, there's no other expenses, relocation expenses in their income. So if anybody were to come to you and say, well, I've lost money as a result of imputed relocation expenses, I didn't get the CARES credit, you really can't know that until the individual files their 2020 return. So don't jump the gun and think that an individual who has relocated, who has relocation expenses in their income, has to be compensated for that now, because it's only going to be known after the 2020 return is filed, because the money that they received is actually a tax credit related to the 2020
right.
tax.
Thank you on that, Jim. Expectations in lieu of policy. Can we touch on that for just 2 minutes before we move into our next topic?
Well, I had one other topic that I wanted to talk about that was very related to cost savings. And not so much policy changes, but there's another provision in the law which is related to IRS Code Section 139, which relates to disaster relief payments and how they're treated. And when President Trump declared the COVID-19 pandemic a natural disaster, it allowed for the implementation of certain favorable tax treatment, in this particular case of relocation expenses. And so we put a process in place to identify any relocation or assignment related expenses that we could directly attribute to the pandemic. Very quick example, somebody who was on assignment in Brazil, it got very hot in Brazil, pandemic-wise, we brought him back, kept him in temporary living for 4 months, and then sent him back. All of the costs associated with that, the travel, the temporary living, the meals, the return back, all of it we were able to treat as non-taxable. And I've got plenty of examples of that from the U.S. domestic relocation side, additional temporary living, storage, things of that nature. Short and sweet, as a result of taking advantage of this provision, we saved $100,000 in gross up for 2020. So there's a real savings opportunity. So if you haven't looked at that as program managers, both on the international and domestic side, make sure that you do that.
That was a huge piece of information to share or even remind. I know many RMCs have coached and guided along that line, but Jim, that is a reawakening to probably many people that are in the room, so to speak.
It's one of those things where you hear about it, I get it, and then we were just so overwhelmed by the change in work environment, the immigration, everything, that it's something that could get quietly missed. And I always say I like to at least save 2 or 3 times my salary every year if I can. And I thought, wow. And when I quantified all of the expenses that we categorized and took the gross up factor of 55%, I said, we saved our company $100,000. That's good.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And all companies are looking for ways of having that savings pocket. Where can we recoup some dollars?
Yeah,
so,
that's a very good point, because while some industries are benefiting very much from the pandemic, depending on what industry you're in, there are a lot of industries, I would say the vast majority of companies are probably suffering in some way from the pandemic. And so I think anytime we can bring some savings to the table,